Wisdom, war. Wisdom, war. And no, you don't have to go to war yet. You get to take a break while you sit in the pew and I stand up here. The real war happens after you leave and as you go back to the warfare of life. Wisdom, war. When we think about wisdom, we might start with that basic question. What is wisdom? We could point to several different definitions. We could go back and start reading several of the proverbs that are known as the sayings of the wise. The wise man Solomon and others who were inspired by God's Spirit to write down divine wisdom. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7 is rightfully pointed to often as we think as Christians about wisdom and its source, that the beginning of wisdom, Proverbs 1:7 says, is the fear of the Lord. Having Him, our view of God, correct. Having that fear, or perhaps reverence is another English word we would think about. But that has to be the starting point. If we really want to have true wisdom and to live our lives in a way that is healthy, in a way that is effective and productive in good, truly good ways, that it will begin with our attitude toward God. And then the parallel in Proverbs 1:7 is that fools, on the other hand, despise wisdom and understanding, or knowledge and instruction. And so we don't want that. But as we consider wisdom, there are options. In a certain sense, there are different kinds or different types of wisdom. Yes. You might think of it this way, that if you had to put them into two categories, there are two basic categories for wisdom. So if you did that, you'd have divine wisdom on the one side, that which comes from God in one way or another, whether it's specifically revealed in His Word or something in a principle that I apply to my life, divine wisdom. The other side, you could call it a few different things. This morning we might say it is worldly wisdom. It's the way that worldly people tend to operate, for lack of a better way to put that. Worldly in the sense of that which is not in the world of creation, but which comes from Satan and becomes worldliness in that way. Could we also call it conventional wisdom? Now, there are some things that we would label conventional wisdom, or we might even say it's common sense, and it is good. It even comes from God. It aligns, at least, with divine revelation. But there are also many things that we hear that are popular in our current society that might fall under that idea of conventional or common wisdom that is not divine wisdom, does not even mesh at all with what is true wisdom. So we use the word wisdom loosely in that way this morning to say there is real wisdom, that's not loosely divine wisdom, and then there's a wisdom that Satan and the world offers. So that becomes those two words then, wisdom, war. Because it's not just two camps or two categories. Those two are in ongoing conflict. There's a reason we have to put them out there as divine wisdom versus worldly or conventional wisdom. It's a war. And it's not necessarily fought on the typical conventional, no pun intended, battlefield. It is fought in battlefield of daily life, of the warfare, the spiritual warfare between divine wisdom and worldly wisdom. Let's compare these two by means of three other categories this morning. Some examples from relationships or family life. Three different examples we'll see in a moment from that. And then three examples from lifestyle. And that's my way of referring to more general principles of how you go about living life, navigating the decisions, making the choices that we make every day. We make thousands of choices every day. Some are rather insignificant, like what flavor of coffee this morning. Others have a much bigger impact, but we don't always perceive the impact as we make them. And then the third category we will close on this morning is the category of religion. Worldly wisdom versus divine wisdom when it comes to religion. Let's compare from these three categories. So we go back to the beginning, relationships. One of the things that we are told in conventional wisdom is that it is okay, and now it's becoming even more popular to not just say that it is okay, as in it's totally fine, it's acceptable and permissible. We're being told that it is good to engage in sexual activity prior to, outside of, and for sure prior to marriage. But that's just the tradition. That's just old people stuff. That's what they say. And really, it doesn't matter. Or maybe even it's healthy to do so. Here's where this comes from. You have to have experience. That sounds good, doesn't it? Most things in life, you want experience ahead of time. So you got to have what they call a high body count to be experienced sexually. Or even if it's with the person that you're dating and you're in a more committed relationship, maybe looking toward marriage, or you're even engaged to them, well, you have to find out ahead of time. You don't want to wait to see if you're sexually compatible. That's the language, isn't it? Now, we could turn to a number of passages. We could talk about how God created marriage in the beginning of creation, as Jesus says, from the beginning in Matthew 19. We could talk about how God created that, and when God creates something, it is healthy and good. And anytime we violate that or we devote ourselves to something else, it becomes problematic. But did you know you can show this from a common sense standpoint? Statistically, that you are more likely to get a divorce. I mean, divorce is pretty high statistically anyway right now, but you are more likely to end that marriage, if it happens, to end in divorce if you engage sexually. It's even higher if you live together. We call it cohabitating today, as if that makes it even somehow better. That raises the likelihood. And this sermon's not against people that are in that kind of relationship, and it's not saying if you did that and now you're married, that your marriage is over or hopeless. That's not the point at all. But it's to recognize that even statistically, you're more likely. The more you engage, the higher your body count prior to getting married. And if you cohabitate and engage sexually with the same person you're going to marry, even, you're that much likely. The statistics are way higher that you're going to end up in divorce. But let's open up the Bible together for a moment. Look at Hebrews chapter 13. Just maybe God knows what He's doing. Hebrews chapter 13, we'll read verse 4 together. As this letter ends, or begins to end, we have in the opening section of chapter 13 a number of imperatives, which is a nice way of saying, here are some things that you need to do or don't need to do. And we get them in a list fashion almost. And so it starts with verse 1, let this happen. And then you get all these lets. And in English, it kind of comes out funny to just say, let this happen, like just let it happen. But it's more, you make sure this is how it happens. And so Hebrews 13, verse 4, the imperative, the let here, the make this happen, is let marriage be held in honor among all. And let the marriage bed be undefiled. For God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. The conventional wisdom says, get the experience, make sure you're sexually compatible. Divine wisdom says, it's actually better to wait. And some have tossed around the idea of a test drive. And you might have seen that where somebody says, you got to go for a test drive. And somebody says, well, human beings aren't vehicles. They're made in the image of God. I'm not sure that wisdom works very well. That's one example in the context of relationships. Another one, you might call it the wedding focus. You could think about it like running a race. And you spend the money and the time in the dating scene or whatever you want, however you want to go about it. And then that day, you get engaged. You spend the money on the engagement ring and the wedding bands and all that. And you spend all the time and the money preparing. Somebody pays for it at least for the big day. And it's your day, right? And you're going to say those vows and you're going to be married, and it's just and it's almost like that is the line. Like that's the end of the race. You finished the race. You made it. Congratulations. You got your marriage certificate. You can check that off your list. You can change your status now from single to married. It's all done. When in reality, the reality hits after marriage. It might not wait until after the honeymoon, but usually it's after the honeymoon, and you come back to real life, and now your new life with this other person begins. But why is it that we tend to focus on the wedding and maybe the honeymoon, and we spend all of our time planning and our effort and our money, and that's the big to-do? I'm not saying it shouldn't be, but how much time and effort do we spend planning and preparing for the rest of the story? And then we wonder, wisdom, why the rest of the story is not so fairy tale after all. Let's open up our Bibles again to Genesis chapter 2 this time. Genesis chapter 2, we'll read the last couple of verses of Genesis chapter 2. We also hear this along those same lines, that it's all about finding the right person. And then there's some wisdom to that for sure. You want to be careful who you marry. But the secret is not find the right person. Find the person that you are made for. Find your, quote, soulmate. And then the rest of the story will take care of itself. Because you found the right person. As long as you're the right person, hopefully they found the right person. Of course, that's always a question too. And then marriage will just take care of itself. You don't have to work. You don't have to be intentional. You don't have to sacrifice or adjust anything in your life. It's all going to be perfect. Here's what Genesis chapter 2 says. And this is a beginning here. So we're not getting the rest of Adam and Eve's story here. But just think about how God describes marriage here. It says in verse 24, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife." I suggest to you that holding fast isn't just talking about the marriage itself, the beginning. That it's something that happens then and then is built on that. And then look at the rest of it. He says, "And they shall become one flesh." That is sometimes viewed as the wedding itself and the exchange that happens and the joining there. Sometimes that's viewed more as what we call the consummation in the marriage bed. But it's that and more. And it's just like that holding fast. It's something that starts there, but it's not the finish line. It's like the beginning of the race. Learning, what does that look like? What does it really mean to be one with another person? We're not the same person, but somehow we're now joined together as one. What does that take? There's going to be difficulties and conflicts and obstacles that come from within the marriage, from without the marriage. How do we work through that and still be one? So it's not about the wedding as much as it is about what happens afterwards. And then the next verse 25, says, "The man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." And if there are experiences and difficulties, traumas in the past, that unashamed part there, I'm not saying it can't happen, but it's not going to be easy. Conventional wisdom says it's about the wedding. Make it great. Divine wisdom would suggest make your wedding great, but make sure you're ready that your marriage itself is great. And then one last one under this heading. Conventional wisdom today says that masculinity is toxic. It's dangerous. And at best, a male figure in the home who is strong and leads his family, protects his wife and children, who is able, barring actual health issues and disabilities, who's able and who intentionally wants to be able to protect his family from spiritual and physical harm, that's either neutral, it just doesn't really matter, it's okay, but doesn't change anything, or it's harmful. And yet the Bible upholds those who take care of their household. Isn't that 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8? The Bible is not afraid to call upon people to be strong and use the comparison of men. Like 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 13. Act like men and do what? Be strong. Or grow up into mature manhood. Act like a man, Ephesians 4. The Bible calls upon the family and gives value to such. And here's the thing. If conventional wisdom is right, that male figure is indifferent or even detrimental to home life for a child, wouldn't that also show up statistically? Wouldn't it be that the homes where the father is missing, those would be the successful model families? But you and I both know that it's the complete opposite. There's something to it within relationships. Worldly wisdom says one thing. Godly wisdom says something else. Now let's turn our attention from relationships to lifestyle. And we might say that this is still involving how we interact with people, how we relate to people, but it's broader than what we think of as marriage and home life. We are told here, in our lives, young people are told this, or at least it is sometimes implied, don't listen to older people. Maybe this connects to some of the other things we were saying a minute ago, right? Your parents, maybe, but your grandparents are going to tell you, wait until you're married. Your grandparents are going to tell you a lot of different things for older generations that just isn't viable in today's world. And we've made such a study out of generational changes that if we're not careful, it has further increased or enforced the separation between generations. At a certain point, we tend to kind of just lock people away. And then there's the new generation. There's people kind of stuck in the middle that have a little input, and then there's no input. And some people will even say things like this. They'll set an age limit on it. Well, I don't listen to anybody over, and they'll say this, decades. Or, I only listen to my peers, my contemporaries. They might not always say that, but they operate on that. Now, don't get me wrong. There is wisdom or advice that comes from an older generation that is not inherently right. They can be wrong too. There are young people, there are 10-year-olds that can teach a lot to 30-year-olds. Wisdom is wisdom, regardless of the source. There is something to the idea that wisdom comes, generally speaking, with age. And part of that is the legitimate experiences that you learn from. There are tons of times throughout the Proverbs when young people are exhorted, listen up, to listen to those that have been there and done that. Proverbs 22, verse 23, if you want to write down something, 22:23 is a very simple statement, and it boils down to listen to your parents. They're not always going to be right. You're going to think they're wrong 99% of the time, but they're probably right 98%, okay? Or what about this one? Leviticus 19, verse 32, that tells us to rise up, and the Bible says it, not me, before the gray-headed. By the way, we've created a cultural thing where looking older, being older, getting those first gray hairs, it's a problem. And you got to somehow, we don't want that. Now, part of that's because we don't like facing our mortality. But part of it is because we have created a cultural idea that says youth is everything. You want vitality and energy and youthfulness. No, don't get old. Now, wouldn't it be nice if you could keep the energy and the vitality of your 30s and have the wisdom and experience of your 60s? That'd be a nice world, wouldn't it? But there's something to be respected and learned from. And Leviticus 19:32 goes on to say, honor them, give them respect, and then he says, fear the Lord. Could we draw a big line from Leviticus 19:32 all the way over to Proverbs 1 verse 7 and say that part of the way I gain wisdom by fearing God is by being open to the wisdom of those who have been there, done that, and maybe even made a few mistakes along the way and learned from those too. Conventional wisdom says, don't listen to people who are older. Divine wisdom says, at least check it out before you make any conclusions that are solid in that way. But conventional wisdom also says in lifestyle and how you live your life, money is everything. It's all about money. It may be true that in politics and sometimes in religion and other things in life, in a way, it is all about money. Some situations, it's about who has the money or who can get the money. But what I mean here is that life isn't about that. Someone once said that life is more than your possessions. His name was Jesus. But worldly wisdom, conventional common sense says, earn as much as you can, as quickly as you can. Sometimes we get on to the fact that the get-rich schemes, those don't work, but we really wish they did. What's the old saying that no one ever on their deathbed said, I wish I'd spent more hours at work. They do say things like, I wish I'd spent more time with my kids when they were little. Or wish I'd taken my wife on more dates. Or I wish I'd taken time to take my grandchildren on a weekend getaway. Have you seen that statistic? It's been going around recently that on the average, by the time your kids are 12, as parents, we've spent 75% of all the time we'll ever get with them. When they are 18 and graduating, 90% of the time you'll ever spend with your children is gone. Is it all about money, or are there other things that are more valuable in life? 1 Timothy chapter 6. Let's read that one together before we have to move on. 1 Timothy chapter 6. We'll begin at verse 6. Paul writes this to young Timothy. Here's some wisdom for Timothy and us today about money and material things. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6. We'll read through 10. He says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many useless or senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. 4. The love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. What's it all about? Well, for one thing, it's not all about money. And then one more, under lifestyle, that revenge is good. Or, if we had to put it into a more pithy wisdom saying, it is treat people the way they treat you. It's a nice little spin on treat people the way you like to be treated. The golden rule, Matthew 7:12. And if someone does something against you, someone does you wrong, someone, what do we say, does you dirty, you just find your opportunity. Be patient. Revenge is best served cold. You'll have a chance. You'll get even with them. And yet the Bible calls us to not return evil for evil, but if anything, to return good when we receive evil. This is coming out of the last part of Romans chapter 12. There's other passages, but Romans 12, 14 through 21 calls upon the child of God to have a higher ethic that says, I don't return what you give to me. I'm going to treat you better than that because of how Jesus has treated me. It changes how I see you, how I treat you. And the funny thing here is that the world does get this. How many times do we see this as a plot in, you see it a lot in Westerns, but you see it in a lot of different movies and shows where it might even be the main character, their character arc is bent on revenge. And then they either get it and they realize it doesn't satisfy, or they realize eventually this isn't what I really want after all, because it's not actually good or healthy for anybody involved. And then this last category this morning. We've seen relationships, lifestyle, and then these in religion. We're told today that Jesus is just a good teacher, a good moral example. And many have no issue applying and appealing to Jesus when it fits their agenda. But then you start saying things like, Jesus is the only way to God. John 14:6, his own words. That Jesus is not just a good teacher, but he is divine. Oh, now you've really done it. It's just that Jesus said some good things. He probably said some things I don't like, but here's some good things he said to do. He said to love people, accept people, and that's all Jesus is. And yet it takes but a bit more, maybe a cursory or a bit more cursory reading of Scripture to know that isn't divine wisdom. Worldly wisdom says, take your pick. Religions, churches, they're like flavors of ice cream. They're all good, but you have your preference. You prefer one over the other. And to that, Paul would say, is Christ divided? Did someone else die for you? That you would follow a man-made religion or even a man-made denomination of Christianity? 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 10 through 13. He calls them out of that thinking. Follow Jesus. But here's where it's shifted. Even in the last 5-10 years. We've seen it since 2020 even more. It's really skyrocketed. It isn't just choose the church of your choice anymore, regardless of what they teach, regardless of what they practice. Now it is that the idea of church of going to church, of having a church family, is optional at best. Or just like a dad, it might even be harmful. And yet we're seeing the same thing with the psychological effects alone. And you could take the truth of God out of the picture for a moment and just look at what happens to people psychologically when they don't have something like that to be a part of. Now again, there's much more to it than that. The Bible calls us the body that are meant to work together and worship together, to lean on one another in the tough times, to celebrate with one another in those bright times. That's divine wisdom. Starts with Jesus and ends with a family like no other. Worldly wisdom says it's okay. It's optional. You get to decide. And that bit of truth says, yeah, it is up to me to decide. God's not going to force me. But here's the wisdom. Take it or leave it. Wisdom war. We've seen this morning 3 ways of living life. Either by finding the jewel, the diamond of divine wisdom, or by finding the fool's gold that might sound good, that might have ways of supporting it. Well, this is how this works normally. Or that it might even be that is how we've always done it, but that's just the way it was for them. We're going to do things differently because we're the new. We're the new wisdom or thinking. And so Gary's going to lead us in an invitation song. We call it that because it's meant to invite all of us, preacher included, to serve Jesus, to come to the one who is much more than just a good teacher, to turn away from the life of worldliness and to embrace the ultimate divine wisdom called Jesus, to put Him on in baptism, to begin a life with a Savior and a Lord called Jesus. If we can assist you in any way this morning in that context, come now while we stand together and sing.